Oh, this thing has magically come on. That's very, very exciting. Are you all okay? Yes, thank you for coming to this session, and hello to the people that are streaming online at home as well. And give me a bit of a cheer and a wave if you have your own podcast. Yay! And how many of you, give me a cheer and a wave, are thinking of turning that into a book? So quite a few people. Do you have a podcast? No, not yet.
I have an idea. I've actually it's more I've done the book, or started the book and that's fed.
Oh, okay, so you're kind of the other way around. Okay, so you need to just listen to us backwards. Yeah, so great. It's great that a lot of you are already thinking about turning your podcast ideas into a book. And I'm Rosie Wilby, and I'm going to be talking a bit about my personal experiences of doing exactly this process, and then afterwards Alice is going to be talking about a broader publishing perspective and perhaps some books that have worked well, and also I'll be sort of talking about some of my experiences that work well, some of the things that I might have done differently. But hopefully between us we'll have some pearls of wisdom, some knowledge for you. And I have been through this process because I turned my podcast, The Breakup Monologues, into a book which came out in hardback last year. I don't know has anyone ever heard of The Breakup Monologues? Yay! Oh, that's good, isn't it? So I must have done some marketing right. And I guess my interest in breakups came about when I was dumped by email a few years ago. And did feel much better about it though once I'd corrected her spelling. And punctuation and changed the font. And so I'm largely going to be talking from the experience of going the fairly traditional route of getting myself a literary agent and then a publisher. My book is published by Bloomsbury, who are obviously a fairly big major publisher, and I kind of set myself that challenge of wanting to get a bigger publisher and have that experience, good and bad. Because I had already published one book with a small indie publisher with limited resources and experienced the good and bad of that sort of smaller kind of publishing company as well. And there are definitely pros and cons for both. And also I know a ton of authors who have self-published books, and that can be a really interesting avenue to go down as well, particularly if you're really hot on marketing and you have a really great, strong audience for your podcast already. So there's no kind of prescriptive way about how you've got to do this, but I can certainly share some of my experiences about going that more traditional route, which I guess Alice may well be talking about a little bit as well. And I guess largely speaking, I'm assuming we're sort of talking about kind of non-fiction books, but we will have a Q&A later where if anyone sort of has fiction ideas that are springing from their podcast, that could be a really interesting avenue as well. Actually, just do a quick wave. Are your podcasts and book ideas non-fiction? Yeah, which is that's non-fiction, like kind of factual, personal, memoir kind of thing. That's probably good, because we're probably going to be talking from that kind of perspective, and the non-fiction pitching process is quite different to pitching a fiction book as well. So I guess really the first strand of what we want to talk about. Oh, and one thing I would say is to perhaps prepare you for the difference of writing a book and having a book come out in the world to podcasting is be prepared for the change in pace. The immediacy of podcasting is definitely not replicated in the traditional publishing world. I handed my book in a year pretty much exactly before it came out, so do be prepared for that sort of time lag, because there are a lot of different processes: cover design, proofreading, typesetting, copy editing, lots of different things that have to happen. Obviously, a press campaign and building up to marketing as well, which we'll talk about. But I think for a lot of content creators, I'm also a comedian, I'm used to jumping up on stage and telling a joke, maybe that day that I've just written it or thought about it. So it's a very different kind of change in pace to acclimatise to. But the first strand that we really want to talk about is repurposing your content. And just so that I wasn't kind of ripping off some copyrighted images, I selected some fun images from my past shows and my past promo campaigns. And I thought this was quite a fun one to illustrate the idea of repurposing your content, because one year at Edinburgh Fringe, my venue got flooded because it rained a lot. Who'd have thought, in Edinburgh? And all my posters were ruined and couldn't be put up, or at least one box of them anyway. So I decided to do a bit of a fun photo where I was hanging the posters on the washing line, and I got this photo on the front cover of the Edinburgh Evening News that day with a plug for the show. So perhaps effectively getting a better plug for the show than the posters might have been in the first place. So I thought that was quite a nice idea of repurposing some content. And I'm a big fan of using content, good ideas, good content across different forms, across different media. Whenever I have a really interesting guest or conversation on the podcast, I find myself thinking, could this be an article? Could I pitch this to one of the sex and relationship editors at Cosmo or Stylist or at the Indie for the Indie Voices column I often write for? So I think it's often good to, and probably all of you are, think about the way you can keep using your ideas and your content, keep reinforcing your brand and getting it out there through different channels, and perhaps positioning yourself as an expert in your field, in your area. And so I do think it's a great thing to be able to, use your ideas in a different form, although one thing I think you do need to be aware of is how to make your book different from your podcast. Why are your audience who've been used to getting your podcast for free going to buy your book? Why are they going to pay for that? And particularly if you're thinking of recording an audio book as well, how is that going to be different from the podcast? I do know some friends who've written a book based on a podcast, which is very much transcriptions of the podcast. My friend Emma Goswell, who does a pod called Coming Out Stories, it very much is that. Although then, of course, she didn't then record a separate audiobook because that would be the same as the podcast. Whereas for me, I was very keen to make it a very different product that people could get something very different out of. And whilst there are a few highlights from the podcast, some of my very, very favourite stories peppered throughout and scattered within there, I, of course, also wanted the overarching narrative that would keep people with a book and want them to follow the story the whole way through. So whereas my podcast is fairly episodic and you can just dip in and listen to one episode, it's a fun live show where different people share their breakup stories with me. We have a chat about love and relationships, how it all works, how it often really doesn't and can be quite a car crash and end in disaster. But you don't necessarily have to have listened to all the episodes to get something from it. Whereas with the book, I wanted to share something I hadn't shared as much of in the pod, which was my own story. Now that I'm in a relationship, why on earth am I still so flippin' obsessed with breakups? And the opportunities for transformation and growth that can sometimes come after a breakup. So I wanted to kind of share that story of my own relationship and what I was getting from still talking about breakups. There's a lot in there about my creative process as well, and actually the behind the scenes of turning the podcast into a book. But I wanted to really have my own personal story, and then illustrate that with some of the guests, some of the best stories, some of the science about heartbreak, and go a bit deeper into some of that more academic stuff that you don't necessarily want to dig too deep into in a sort of exciting, fast-paced live show. I wanted to start thinking a little bit more thematically around my podcast and start thinking about sort of chapter ideas and start theming the episodes of the pod a little bit more, so that I would start having a book structure start to emerge, start to appear. So I started thinking about having episodes on friendship breakups or professional breakups, or how polyamory changes the conversation about breakups. And so you start to get a flavour of what your book proposal, what your sort of chapter summaries may start to look like, and start to get a feel of the pace of your writing as well. So if once you start writing maybe a sample chapter, look at whether you like writing long chapters or shorter chapters. I tend to quite like writing shorter chapters of about 2,000 to 2,500 words, so that it's got a kind of nice paciness. Whenever I'm reading a book, I kind of get annoyed if the chapter seems to go on forever. So I quite like having lots of chapters. It's very much a personal taste thing. So my book has about 30 chapters. So once you start getting a feel for what your pace of writing is and whether you like shorter chapters, you'll know how many that you'll need in a book proposal, which takes us neatly on to the next chapter that we'll be talking about here, which is pitching your idea. How many people here already have got a literary agent? No, nobody yet, but you will soon. And yeah, I mean, one of those questions I sometimes get asked is, do you need a literary agent? And I certainly know authors who have pitched to publishers without having an agent, so it's not 100% essential, but it seems to help a lot in general with the process of getting your work out there, getting your idea out there. So I would say in most cases it is going to help you, because you're going to be able to get it to publishers who won't necessarily look at a submission from an author directly. But I do know people who've been able to do it that way if they've cultivated a relationship, perhaps on Twitter or social media, with a publisher more directly. And so for me, I started to develop a relationship with an agent because I had basically a brilliant catalogue of guests coming onto the show when I was recording live episodes at festivals, and sometimes the festival would hook me up with a brilliant guest who was already at the festival, which is, a wonderful way of sometimes getting access to guests that you've been trying to get and you haven't been able to. So in 2019 now, I was due to be recording a live episode at a wonderful festival in Cornwall called Port Eliot Festival, which sadly is no more. But the festival had hooked me up with Katie Brand and Miranda Sawyer, who were two wonderful guests. It was a really lovely episode. And Katie had a book coming out at the time about her obsession with the film Dirty Dancing. And I don't know if anyone read that book. I think it's called I Carried a Watermelon, which is, of course, a classic line from the film. And I noticed that her literary agent was a woman called Catherine Summerhays, who at Curtis Brown Books, who I knew a little already because one or two of my friends work with her, a writer and podcaster called Viv Groskop, who you may know, who occasionally has kindly given me a bit of advice about my book proposals and that kind of thing. So I felt able to email Catherine and ask if she might be able to connect me with Katie so that I could check if there was anything she wanted to discuss or not discuss on the podcast, but also just discreetly mention that I was thinking about turning my podcast into a book. When I had a proposal ready, would she be perhaps interested in taking a look? And, to Catherine's credit, she was very receptive to that and said, yes, she definitely would take a look at it. And so there was one other agent who had been interested after my first book, and so I just really had those two people that I wanted to target. For me, I decided to be quite focused, and I thought I'm definitely going to work with one of these two people because they were both good agents, and I thought they would be good people who would get it to some good publishers. But also, equally, I know writers who send tons and tons of agents and kind of, either get loads of interest or, eventually find one or two that are interested and then decide from there which one they want to work with. It's a good idea to have a look at who is working with particular authors that you like, because then you can engage with them about those books that you've read, that you like. Also have a look on their website whether they've got a long client list or a really short client list, because if you want an agent who is going to really talk you through a lot of the process, you don't want someone like my agent Catherine, who's got a long client list and she's just super busy, and she's fabulous, she's really lovely and friendly, but actually she really doesn't have a lot of time. So you have to just get used to the fact that she's not going to spend hours and hours talking you through every step of the process. So I've had to do a lot of stuff and learn a lot of stuff myself, but she has done the really, really vital bit of getting my proposal to that publisher who said yes. And then Curtis Brown are actually pretty good on taking care of contracts and that kind of thing, which is all incredibly useful, because it could be a bit scary if you were navigating all of that on your own. So what you want to do to start pitching around for an agent is write a non-fiction proposal, which is quite a substantial document. If you do know other writers who've written one and who've been successful, maybe you could ask them if you could sneak a look at theirs and see what worked for them. But most literary agents will have some guidelines on their website about the kind of thing that they're looking for. It typically is something like a writing sample of a few thousand words. I sent about 5,000 words to Catherine. It was about a couple of chapters for me. You'll want chapter summaries that give an overarching structure for the entire book. You probably want a little bit about a sort of marketing plan, your ideas about how you're going to tie in the marketing for the podcast and the book, and what your sort of target audiences are, what your existing audiences are, how you're going to sort of transfer those to engaging with the book, possibly a delivery date, an estimated word count, and also the sort of elevator pitch for your book, the little blurb that is either on the back or with this hardback, it's the sort of the blurb that comes there. And that may well be slightly different to your podcast blurb. As I say, you want to make sure these are slightly different products. They're complementary and they're linked, but they are different products that you hope your fans are going to engage with additionally. So hopefully once you've got your non-fiction proposal together, you can then send it to some agents and hopefully start engaging with them. And then you will, I hope, get one or two publishers interested. And then once you get offered a contract, like I say, probably your agent will take care of that and look through that. But if you are working with a smaller agent or a smaller publisher, some things to look out for that I didn't completely understand when I was working on my first book was my royalties for that first contract were a percentage of net receipts and not cover price, and that is something really important to look out for and maybe query, because certainly with this new book, many of my royalties are a percentage of cover price, which is obviously much better than net receipts, because net receipts is a lot less because it's after Amazon or whoever have taken their quite large chunk in some cases. So yeah, have a look for those kind of things. You'll probably find that some of the royalties overseas and so on might be net receipts, but there should be a bit of a mixture rather than everything being net receipts. Also, you may want to do something that I tend to do, because I go out and about and I perform and gig a lot and record a lot of live episodes around festivals and venues. I quite like having the opportunity to buy discounted copies of my own book and then sell them at a profit. Another thing to be wary of about this, though, is that often if you do that, these books may not count in terms of royalties and official sales that go through an official scanner. So it's just another thing to be aware of. It may look like your book isn't selling as many as it actually is in reality, and that's something I learned again with my first book, where I was selling kind of thousands directly, but it looked officially like it hadn't really sold that much. Also, if you're narrating the audio book, you should get an additional fee for that, but that'll probably be negotiated afterwards and separately. And if you are narrating that, you'll get paid per finished hour, which is PFH, which was another abbreviation I didn't understand, but that's basically your finished hour of audio. So my books are both about 65,000, 70,000 words, which is about 7 hours of audio. So you get paid for 7 hours, basically, of whatever the rate is. So yeah, it's worth not just spending hours and hours noodling away in the studio, because you won't get paid for sitting having a cup of tea. They do have breaks because it's quite intense. So yeah, once you've signed your contract, you're on to kind of the writing process, and you'll have a delivery date for delivering your first draft. And just be aware that that first draft, well, actually, that probably won't be your first draft when you deliver it. You'll have probably done lots of edits and redrafts before then. What I did was, before I sent it to my editor, I had a friend who's a fellow writer, and she gave me some feedback, and we did some sessions together just because I love her writing and I wanted her advice on feedback on structure. And so, you'll go through a few rounds of edits with your editor and go back and forth, and then you'll probably get passed maybe to a managing editor who will oversee the sort of finer edits, the copy edits, the kind of proofreading, the typesetting, and just checking that chapter headings are staying the same and that kind of thing. So it takes quite a while to go through all these various stages. And then the next thing to really talk about, the final thing that I'm going to be talking about, is marketing. Maybe could I just get you to maybe volunteer some, how do you think you could market your book? Where might you market it? What are some different ways you could market your book? Instagram, well, yes, social media in general, but Instagram is brilliant. Hashtag Bookstagram, as they say. On your own podcast, exactly. And I would say guesting on other people's podcasts and doing that reciprocal kind of promo is a really great idea. So even now, start building those relationships and start, maybe offering people guest slots on your podcast in the hope that maybe they'll do it when you need that, and help people promote their books and stuff. And what else do we have?
Excerpts in the press.
Yeah, excerpts in the press. That's called Serial, and that's not done as much as it used to be. Reviews, features, extracts may happen in some cases, particularly if it's of particular relevance to a publication. I mean, I've got a chapter about midlife and about being two perimenopausal women on a boating holiday together. And how we nearly broke up then. And so Noon, which is a kind of midlife women's website, actually published that extract. What your publisher might do is they might publish proof copies, which is like an uncorrected advance copy, which has a sort of paperback cover, but a temporary cover, and it'll say this is an uncorrected proof, but that's what they mean when they're going to send out a proof copy, or some people call it an ARC, Advanced Review Copy, and so those can go to the journalists a bit ahead of time so that they can check it out and see if they can review it. So also, if you don't have physical proofs like that, depending on whether your publisher do them, another thing they may do is there's a platform called NetGalley, where they put up like a digital proof beforehand, and so that's a platform where people can make little reviews and comments and stuff. And I found some of the people who liked it on there then did reviews on Instagram and perhaps posted them on Amazon as well. And what I would say is do network with your community of journalists, start building relationships, because although your publisher will have lots of contacts, it's really your relationships that will make your book and your book campaign a success, because it's the people who know you that will reply to your publisher and say, oh yes, I know Rosie, I know the Breakup Monologues, I'd like to write about that. And just make sure when you do guest on podcasts, get them to include your book title in their blurb. If they will link to the book, that's brilliant. Just have a think about where you want to send people in general to buy it. I've typically found that Amazon, love it or hate it, is a pretty useful place, because you have a sales ranking on there and you have an algorithm, which means that if people go there and look at it or review it and so on, it does kind of help it to stay more visible there. So not everyone likes Amazon, so it's nice to have some indie options as well if you have indie bookshops that you have a good relationship with as well. And on that note, I should say that, of course, copies of my book are available on the Newham bookstall here today, and I will be signing at 11:45, which is just after this session ends. But yeah, that's all from me really, other than to say keep in touch on Twitter at Rosie Wilby, on Instagram at Breakup Monologues, and I will now hand over to the fabulous Alice, who will talk more about the publisher perspective, but I hope that was a bit of fun perspective from my experience. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosie. God, that was brilliant. And yeah, no pressure going on stage after a stand-up. Thanks, Rosie. So just to introduce myself, I'm Alice Lloyd. I'm not a publisher, if that's what you were expecting. I am an audio person. So my background is I worked for the BBC for many years, making documentaries for Radio 1 and 1 Extra. And then I went to a company called Wise Buddha that's now called Listen, and I was the exec producer of all their speech content. And then I was recruited by Orion in 2019 because publishers were basically starting to see, audio is a really big thing, and we do audiobooks, but maybe there's kind of more opportunities with podcasting, and audiobooks and podcasting have sort of been on a parallel rise in terms of popularity. And they sort of said, can you come in and just do some experimenting with some audio, see how you do, maybe get some podcasts going. And that's what I've been doing. I've done some podcasts that have sat alongside some of the books we've done at Orion. So I've done something with Giles Yeo, who's a Cambridge geneticist, called Giles Yeo Choose the Fat. And I've done something with the Speakmans, who are a therapy couple from This Morning. I don't know if you know those guys. Made for podcasts. They are absolutely fantastic. And we did something called Making the Change, 3 series of that. And then most recently, I actually sold a podcast to BBC Sounds called Tony Bellew is Angry. And so, yeah, that was something a bit different, selling to another platform. So that's what I've been doing at Orion. And the reason I guess it's useful for me to talk to you is because even though I am an audio person, I sit alongside an imprint at Orion called Trapeze, and they are fantastic imprint, really sort of forward-thinking. Their tagline is books that start conversations, and one of their remits is to kind of reach new audiences on digital platforms. And so it was actually the head of that imprint, Anna Valentine, who recruited me because she wanted me to sort of look at audio opportunities for their books. And it's actually Trapeze at Orion that have produced quite a lot of books of podcasts. So some of the examples of podcasts Trapeze have produced are a book of the Alice and John podcast. We've done the book of stuff you should know. We've done My Favourite Murder. We've done Red Handed. We've done Joan and Jericha. That's just a few of them. So I thought I'd start by I guess overlapping a bit with what Rosie said, but why podcasts are such good source material for books. And basically, publishers, I go to our editorial meetings every week, and everyone sits down and says, right, who's got some ideas? So we don't only take submissions from agents, which Rosie talked really brilliantly about, and it is really useful to have an agent, but we do also constantly look at things, you know, what's going on in TV, what's going on in the podcast world, and sort of look for ideas. And we will, you know, I'm in that meeting every week, and I'm constantly telling people what's doing really well, what's new in the podcast chart. So we're always looking for those opportunities. Typically, because we are a commercial company, Orion, very money-oriented, we try and look for the most commercial opportunities. So the books I mentioned there are obviously really massive podcasts. And, you know, they will want to look at people's social media profile, how many followers they've got. You know, it's basically trying to take as many of those podcast listeners and their platform and translate that into book sales. And that's really the sort of key ambition when someone in a publishing company is trying to make a book from a podcast. One of the issues with that is obviously the data is really hard to get hold of. And book data is much more transparent. You can kind of access sales figures for books in a way that you can't for podcasts. And so you're really relying quite heavily on someone like Rosie very kindly sharing their their data with you, their demographics. You know, often a podcast will be huge in America and people will talk about it as a global #1 hit podcast, but actually the buyers in the UK or the listeners in the UK are really small. So you might think, is that going to make the best book in a British book market? Because actually it's America where most of the listeners are. So having access to that demographics is really helpful, and your listening figures, if you're happy to share that, and that's really useful for publishers. Rosie also talked about non-fiction, and that is the space we work in as well in terms of the books, the podcasts we turn into books, just because the overlap is fantastic. So many non-fiction podcasts out there, loads of opportunities for non-fiction books, and that sort of Venn diagram of non-fiction podcasts, non-fiction books, and you want that overlap in the middle where the people who listen to non-fiction podcasts are the same people who want to buy a non-fiction book. And there's a nice kind of little overlap you're sort of aiming for in there. And then obviously the content of podcasts is brilliant for books. So, you know, the sorts of things that have been picked up recently, some of the big podcasts, Table Manners, they were quite creative with what they did with that, and they did a cookbook. No Such Thing as a Fish has done some amazing publishing, really excellent, and obviously the content there is just endless, you know, kind of interesting, nerdy facts about stuff. You know, you can just go on with that kind of publishing. The Receipts have published a book, actually, in our sister company. Orion's owned by a big umbrella company called Hachette, and Headline, who are also a Hachette company, published The Receipts recently. And actually that book is quite closely aligned, I would say, to the podcast in terms of just the feel, but when you read it, it's very sort of reassuringly their voices, and it's like listening to an episode with them. It's all the sort of content you would expect. And then, of course, you know, the huge mega hitters like My Dad Wrote a Porno. Of course, that podcast has had a book. They're the masters of merch and spin-offs, which is kind of pretty meta because it was based on a book in the first place. So I thought I would talk you through some of our recent successes in this space. So I don't know how many of you know the Red Handed podcast. Any fans, listeners, regular listeners? Have any of you bought the book? No. Aha! We have one red-handed, yes, one red-handed book buyer. Fantastic. So we've got the pod artwork on the left, and that was the book cover we went for. And the brilliant thing is because the authors make the Red-Handed podcast and sort of own the IP of that name, we can use the same name on the book. And that is sometimes an issue, depending on the content of the podcast and who owns it, as whether a publisher can then come along and slap the same title on it. So that's something to bear in mind, how closely you want to align those things, or whether maybe that doesn't matter if the author/podcaster is so huge in their own right. It's sometimes not as important. So this book sold really well. It was a Sunday Times bestseller, and that was definitely in part thanks to approaching them having just such a massive platform. They're huge. Everyone knows they're an enormous podcast. They've got a really, really loyal following, and you know that translated really well into sales. They had an amazing network they could tap into. If you do listen to the podcast, you probably heard them promoting the book week in and week out, which is an absolute joy for a publisher. That's what you want. You really want to hear, and publishers will be listening in, going, they said they were going to promote it this week, have they? So yeah, we do check up. And yeah, basically they were a kind of a dream scenario in terms of publishing a book. And a big chunk of their audience, that UK-US thing I talked about earlier, big chunk of their audience are in the UK, so it did really well, that book, in the UK. So, another book we've done recently. We really like murder at Trapeze. And this one, I mean, this was sort of next level even, beyond Red-Handed. It's almost like Red-Handed, but mega, because it is one of the biggest podcasts in the world. And actually, even though it is US-based, they do have loads of listeners in the UK as well. So the demographics worked really well. And this sold phenomenally well. It was a New York Times #1 bestseller and a Sunday Times bestseller in the UK, which is quite a hard thing to do, actually, to be a #1 in in the US and then do really well in the UK as well. And yeah, according to Edison, they are one of the top 10 most popular podcasts in the world. Social media, 382,000 followers on Twitter. I actually thought that was going to be bigger, but nearly 1 million followers on Instagram. And with the titles here, obviously the podcast artwork is on the left here. The podcast was called My Favourite Murder, and we used that massively on the cover, as you can see, but we did actually call the book Stay Sexy and Don't Get Murdered. That is the title of the book. But you can see they've been given equal prominence on the cover because obviously we want to appeal to the podcast fans. So, and because they own the sort of rights to that, we could use the title of the podcast huge on the cover like that, and absolutely appeal to the murderinos. But what is really, really interesting about this book is the content is completely different from the podcast. And actually, out of interest, has anyone read this book? Really recommend it. And the fans loved it because it's a memoir and it's about them. And they revealed loads of stuff that they hadn't talked about on the podcast, you know, struggles with addiction, struggles with eating disorders. And I think it was just a very revelatory, fascinating memoir written really well. And the book worked in its own right. And that, again, something that Rosie was speaking about, that actually, if you have a book that stands up in its own right, you don't have to just appeal to the podcast fans. You've got a much broader market. And again, working for a commercial publisher, that's what they're interested in, reaching as many people as possible. So that was why that was a good one for us. I thought I'd talk about this one because, so we published this last year, and I think the paperback is coming out this year. And this is what I talked about earlier. This is a BBC podcast, and publisher can't just go in and go, we're going to make the book of a BBC podcast, because the BBC own the rights to the content of that podcast and the title. So this is quite a hard thing to do in publishing, is to work out, are they known in their own right and big enough as personalities that actually the book, even though we can't use any of the podcast branding, can we just sell it on them, their platform, the people, the fact that people love them? And so you can see this is the podcast. Fortunately, I don't know how many of you know that or like that one. Yeah, it's really popular. And this is what we called the book. Did I say that out loud? Notes on the chuff of life. And that is one of the things it's a little podcast phrase that they use quite a lot. And basically what's brilliant about, so these are two BBC presenters, Jane Garvey and Fee Glover. They are incredibly warm, incredibly funny. And what we did with the book was, it was a series of essays, and they took it in turns to write an essay. And it was about all the stuff that you would expect them to talk about and their podcast fans love. So things like hair, divorce, forgetting your passwords, growing older, Christmas, stuff that chimes with their audience and really speaks to who they are and what people really love about them. And it is a really excellent, funny book that showcases the very best of them. And actually, what was particularly interesting with this was the audiobook. And Rosie touched on the importance of the audiobook. And my audiobook colleague, Paul, he sort of does a bit of a heart sink when someone, it comes into what we call our acquisitions meeting, that someone's going to buy a book of a podcast, because he's like, no, what am I going to do with the audiobook? Because his worst nightmare is no one's going to listen to the audiobook because they'll just get the podcast for free. Why would they buy an audiobook? And if the content is really closely aligned, you're sort of slightly shooting yourself in the foot. It does work, and as Rosie said, people don't always do an audiobook. You know, that's one solution. But if you want that extra element, it's always going to work better if your book is completely different. So like with Stay Sexy, Don't Get Murdered, completely different book. So the audiobook worked brilliantly as well in its own right and didn't overlap with the podcast. And that was the same with this. And actually, even though I don't work on audiobooks normally, where there's sort of some fun or a bit of creativity to be had, I will kind of get stuck in and get involved. And I love these two anyway. And I'd sort of obviously worked at the BBC for many years, so I felt quite loyal to them and wanted to do a really brilliant audiobook for them. So what we did was we thought, what will bring the podcast listeners to the audiobook? So they don't just think, well, I listen to them for free on a podcast, why am I going to buy an audiobook? I thought the content is original, but we want it to sound like the podcast, because if people just hear them reading out their book, they're going to be like, this doesn't sound like Fee and Jane, where's all the chemistry? So we recorded the audiobook in the room with them together, sat opposite each other, kind of listening to the other one read out their essay, which they found uncomfortable and hilarious at the same time. And you get that nice, at the end, they'd sort of chat to each other, and then before the next essay, one would ask the other, why did you write this essay, what's it about? All completely ad-libbed, really relaxed, lots of lovely outtakes and laughter. And we just brought some of that nice, relaxed podcasty vibe to the audiobook. And that's, I think more and more, obviously as an audio person working in a publisher, I'm desperate for people to think really hard about the audiobook and how to make that work as well as the book. So it's really worthwhile doing that. And then this is my last example. Dear Joan and Jericha, which is very different. Any of you know this podcast? Yeah. Yeah, it was a wry chuckle from Rosie there, because this is absolute filth. And basically, that's come out really blurry. Sorry about my bad image on the left there. It's a fiction podcast. And actually, it is harder to translate fiction podcasts into books. It can be quite a hard thing to do. Non-fiction is generally where most people publish. But they're just so funny, and there's just a weird thing at Orion that there was a sort of slightly obsessive number of people who were obsessed with this podcast in a kind of cultish way. And when it came out that they were up for writing a book, we fought very, very hard. And you sometimes get into what's called like an auction, which is a competitive auction to try and win the book. And we really went for it, pulled out all the stops. And won it. And so this is Julia Davis and Vicky Pepperdine, who are comedians, writers, actors, absolutely brilliant. And again, the problem would be, how do you stop it completely overlapping with the podcast? And they just came up with some fantastically funny, bonkers, like original content. They didn't just chuck it out. It wasn't just... sometimes you can tell if a book has just been chucked out of the podcast, almost like, oh, let's just do it. It'll be easy. They really slogged away at this book. They wrote some hilarious stuff. It's really funny. It's got some really weird drawings. It's everything that fans of the podcast would want from a book. I guess the downside of that is it was so closely tied to the podcast, and it is quite a niche thing, that there wasn't really a broader market for that book. But it did still do really well. So I just thought I'd summarize with some of the kind of main things to think about when you are thinking about turning your podcast into a book. So obviously, it really helps if you can have something completely different. It can be aligned, it can overlap in terms of vibe and content, but if you can have a unique product, you're going to appeal to more book buyers. And ultimately, if you want a commercial book that sells, that's really important. Appeal to people who don't know the podcast. Yeah, that's the same thing. Try and reach book buyers as well as podcast listeners. Think really hard about the audiobook. I just think audiobooks are just... Paperback sales have been sort of dipping slightly post-pandemic. Audiobook sales are still just going up following the same trajectory of podcasts, so why wouldn't you think really hard about audiobooks? There's such scope in publishing for audio in that way. So yeah, think of something really special if you can. We do throw in extras sometimes and all sorts. And then finally, promote. We are always going to be really happy as publishers the more time the authors can go out. Rosie is an absolute prime example of someone who does this, goes out to festivals. She's brilliant, like a dream for publishers. You want someone to really put the hours in, do PR, speak, and just be there to sort of use every opportunity to push the book. And that's it from me. So I think we're going to take some questions.
Yes. Microphone, if you want to put your hand up, and I will come to you. The lady in the front.
Shall I move this? Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to first. I'll come to you next.
A little bit closer.
Yeah, sure. Is there a slide with our socials on again? Yeah, that's probably good to have for this.
Hello, thank you. That was really interesting. I have a client who has a very long-standing podcast of 10 years. I'm not going to mention his name, but I think Rosie probably knows him, who interviews comedians about what they do, and he has over 400 interviews now. And I'm trying to persuade him that it's a no-brainer to make it into a book. I have two problems, and I wonder if you can help me with them. One is release forms. Did you have them before you made your book? Because that wasn't thought of before those interviews were a book wasn't thought of before. And the second thing is, actually writing a book is a bit of a stumbling point for some people who are very good on just speaking, but aren't so great on the page. And are there possibilities for working with a person to help them actually get things on a page rather than just from speaking?
Yeah. I would love to be on his podcast, by the way, if it's who I... Let's talk about that. I think it is a different thing. It's a different discipline, getting those words down on a page. And there are people, and I've done this, just one person directly asked me if I would help them formulate their book, because I do quite enjoy that kind of structuring the narrative and getting the voice across and helping that person express those ideas on the page. So I have started doing some of that work, but there will be lots of other people like me as well who will do that. But, we can talk about that. So definitely come and find me and we can talk. But yeah, there'll be lots of people who, or even, kind of more official sort of ghostwriters who would sort of, interview you and almost write it for you. But yeah, there's lots of different people who will help put that together if the writing process is daunting. And it is really daunting and lonely. I was writing during lockdown, which was a very kind of weird, lonely time. Some ways nice because you had not so many distractions. But also in terms of permissions, I typically hadn't got people to sign any official documents before being on the podcast. But I was told by my publisher, and I hope this is okay, this was true, but they said so long as I had some kind of informal email that I sent to people saying I would like to use things you said on the podcast in a book, is that okay? That would be fine. And lots of people replied and said, yeah, that's absolutely fine. Can't even remember what I said, but it's fine. So, yeah, you do need to make some effort to contact those people and check or just let them know. And certainly the logic I heard from my publisher was that even if they don't reply, the fact that you've made that effort to let them know, offer to let them see the pages that they're on, maybe screen grabs of the pages that they're on, that should be okay. And obviously if you're quoting people's work more broadly in general, you need to make sure you have permissions for that. I've quoted one or two people who'd sent me copies of their books on related topics, and I'd got permissions to quote things like that. But generally, you don't want to quote song lyrics, do you, Alice? That's a...
No. Or quoting from books is quite a logistical nightmare as well, actually. But yeah, it can be done.
It can be done.
Yeah.
I mean, they were friends of mine who I'd got written permission, and I do quote one song lyric, but again, that's a friend who had...
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think you will want to get, but you can get retrospective permission, that's fine. And then maybe think going forwards, just as someone who's worked in audio for a long time, it really helps to have a sort of upfront contributor release form, because then if your presenter kind of owns all the content from that program, you can then, if you've got your guests to sign that, you then own that content, and that includes being able to sort of transcribe it. But a sort of, you can slightly fudge it by précis-ing it rather than quoting it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good get out, yeah.
Yeah, you can do that. It's how much you'd want to do that through an entire book. It might be a bit odd if that's what the book's based on. But yeah, go for retrospective permission, maybe.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Angie. Nice to meet you both, Rosie and Alice. Thank you for your time. I have a question around the. It's for Alice, I think. More. It's around you mentioned about the followers and how publishers obviously looking into that. So my question is twofold. One is, how did we used to do back in the days before social media, when that wasn't really, and can that maybe be a source of help for people who aren't really big on social media, not really a fan of social media? And the second part of that is, what is the alternative other than self-publishing to gain that kind of, once you have the idea and the pitch and the proposal, to then approach either an agent or a publisher?
Yeah, so that's a really good question about pre-social media, because I didn't work in a publisher pre-social media. I'm trying to think, what did any of us do before social media? It's like the brains just blocked it all out. Yeah, books were still published, have been for years, so they must have been able to sell. I mean, they probably just relied very heavily on PR, much more. So, and like Rosie was talking about serial, and actually they call it doing the sofas in publishing. So with like big commercial books, you see the spikes on Amazon. It's bonkers. I've seen it happen. You get an author onto This Morning and the spike just goes up on Amazon, and it can just go, book can shoot up to #1. So people still do that kind of old school going around doing PR. The thing Rosie was talking about, going on other people's podcasts, you can still do all that slog of selling it word of mouth, going on podcasts, doing press, all those sorts of things. It doesn't sort of live and die on social media. And actually, it's a good question to ask, because more and more people are kind of giving up social media. So we might go back to that kind of old school thing. And then the other question was about...
Yes, I guess I think you kind of answered it already. Like, what is the alternative for us who are like social media?
Yeah, I think just old school, plugging around.
Can I just flag up live events? I think are incredible in terms of actually how many people are there and the number, the sort of percentage of people that buy a book at a live event. We've just had a great show that's going to be higher than, the actual percentage will be higher than when you're on telly or something, even though the number might not be. But the engagement, the quality of the engagement, I don't think you can replicate. I was at this. I do a lot of LGBT events and festivals, and particularly when I'm talking to that audience. I was at this wonderful festival in Wales just last weekend called Out and Wild, and we had an absolutely packed out show in the spoken word tent, and we sold all the books that the bookseller had been able to get hold of, and we had to go and get my emergency box of my own stock and start selling those. I would say live events. I'm quite old school. I still think meeting people face to face is still great. Yeah,
Rose is absolutely spot on. Actually, publishers, PR and marketing teams are the best in the business I've ever met. Like, in my career of being in audio and publishing, it's just like it's given equal space. Sales, marketing and PR are given as much sort of prominence as the editorial team working on the book from the moment of buying a book, because that is thought about from the start. So that would just be something you'd bring into that conversation really early on.
We've got about 5 more minutes left, so...
Hi, my name's Karen Rice. I created Stolen Goodbyes, which is dedicated to people who lost loved ones in the pandemic. The podcast won an award last summer, and just following your talk, I deliberately sort of kept myself fairly in the background in terms of doing the interviews on the podcast, because I felt obviously that their voices needed to be the most prominent. So I'm just wondering, in terms of doing a book, whether that would be an advantage or a disadvantage, really.
I mean, I think the content sounds so powerful that, in non-fiction books, you get all sorts of books where the author isn't the big thing. And obviously, like, the examples I've given today are sort of very big, shiny commercial examples, but there's plenty of other examples in the publishing world of sort of smaller podcasts that have just where the content is phenomenal. And you look at non-fiction books, there's books that do phenomenally well, written by journalists, books from the pandemic, even the one about the scientists that, the race to make the AstraZeneca vaccine, that book has done phenomenally well. They weren't necessarily names that you would recognize, but if you've got strong content, which it sounds like you have, that is what the PR team would use to sell a book. Yeah.
Sorry, got time for just one last question.
Thanks so much. That was really interesting. My question, I guess, is a little bit more of a technical one. It's around if a podcast is aligned to a network, how does that work? I know you've mentioned, if it's owned by the BBC, it's different. But if the podcast is owned by a network or produced by a network, how does that change things when putting a book out into the world?
Do you mean like an Acast or something like that? Or
yeah, any network.
Any network. It probably would be similar to the BBC, to be honest. If you're a podcast presenter and you've sold your idea early on to that network and it's called like a Spotify original or something, Spotify will probably try and take those rights from you. But that's a really useful thing to know about, and Rosie could speak to this, about holding on to your rights. If you've started the podcast and then you want to sell it to a platform for more money, just make sure you cut a deal where you get to hold on to some of those rights. I don't know if Rosie has anything to add on that, but
yeah, I think that would be a good idea. I'm an independent podcaster, so to some extent there's a beauty in that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. If you have any additional questions, there are the details up there if you can fill them through. But right now, I think it might be a good opportunity to thank Rosie and Alice for such a wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank you.